Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasper, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the museum generally, for inviting me to come here and give this talk. I was lucky enough to see the exhibition this morning. I know many of you will have seen it already. Some of you may not have done. It is always a very exciting occasion to see an exhibition of Rothko. But to see an exhibition of Rothko where there's an existing collection it seems to be speaking to and having a conversation with is, I think, a very exciting experience. I was enjoying the moment earlier on, looking through a doorway between two Rothkos where I could see the great Raphael painting of St. Margaret with the gaping mouth of the dragon, which looked to me a little like a Rothko in itself, strangely. So it's a great experience, and I hope you enjoy seeing the exhibition. I'm going to talk about, as Jasper mentioned, I'm going to talk about colour in Rothko, especially the colour red, and really why he uses red, why so much red. Because something you might have noticed as you walk through the exhibition is how many red paintings there are and how hard it is to use a single word, the word red, to describe that wide variety of reds that Rothko uses. So I thought, what do I do? What am I thinking when I think of this idea about red being a word that we use for thousands of different possible colors? And I go to Josef Albers and his wonderful book, Interaction of Color. This is my copy of this book, which is, I'm going to read from a very short extract from Interaction of Color, which was published in 1963, which I think is a very interesting way of thinking about how color works in Rothko's paintings and in paintings in general. If one says red, the name of a color, and there are 50 people listening, it can be expected that there will be 50 reds in their minds. And one can be sure that all these reds will be very different. Even when a certain color is specified, which all listeners have seen innumerable times, such as the red of the Coca-Cola sign, which is the same red all over the country, they will still think of many different reds. Even if all the listeners have hundreds of reds in front of them from which to choose the Coca-Cola red, they will again select quite different colors, and no one can be sure that he has found the precise red shade. And even if that round red Coca-Cola sign with the white name in the middle is actually shown so that everyone focuses on the same red, each will receive the same projection on his retina, but no one can be sure whether each has the same perception. When we consider further the associations and reactions which are experienced in connection with the color and the name, probably everyone will diverge again in many different directions. Now, I hope that's quite a useful, I hope it's useful, I find it useful, way of thinking about the fact that as we sit in this room right now looking at these two paintings by Josef Albers from his series called Homage to the Square, that we are in fact seeing different paintings to each other. Everyone is seeing a different painting because the way we experience color is filtered through our experience of the world, our experience of our own lives. Color is something that is deeply subjective and deeply intertwined with our memories, our senses, our emotions, and our feelings. And I think that's why Rothko, who was an artist who was deeply committed to the idea of emotional communication, of speaking using color, was committed to using color in a communicative way. You might say that Rothko's use of color is almost musical. Here are two paintings by Rothko. They just happen to be in the same room of the exhibition. And they're two paintings produced in different years, where if we take that Josef Albers text, we think about using the word red, just look for yourself how many different reds there are, even in these poor reproductions. Because it should be said, something that many of you I'm sure will know, is that Rothko has to be seen in the flesh. You've got to get up close as far as you can. Now, there's quite a loud alarm actually, which I set off earlier on today. But I will talk a bit more about getting close to Rothko later. But even in these terrible reproductions that I have, the density of paint is such that the number of different reds that appear before the eye is countless. And the emotions that each red evokes in each of us is completely different. As we bring to our experience of these paintings our experiences of every red we've ever seen. Rothko is very hard to talk about. I'm going to try my best. Rothko is hard to talk about because his is the kind of painting that defeats language. His is the kind of painting that makes language seem a bit pale and weak and useless. His is the kind of painting that seems to speak to us in a different register. And I would say that's a little like music. Rothko, like Kandinsky, believed that music had its greatest cousin in color. That colors used in a certain way, with a certain intensity, and in certain combinations, could act a little like sound, could act a little like musical notes, which, as we know, you don't need to be an art historian or an intellectual to appreciate. You just need to have ears. So that slightly defeats my purpose here. I'm not trying to do myself out of a job. I want to keep being an art historian. And I'm interested in artists that defeat language. I'm interested in artists whose work exists slightly outside of our ability to describe it. Rothko is very difficult to describe. But what I want to talk about is red, is that color. To try and be specific about it, and to try and think about what he's doing when he uses it. Now, you've not only got to see the Rothkos in the flesh, you've got to see the Rothkos in color. And of course, probably doesn't need to be you don't need to be reminded of the fact that many people's experiences of Rothko in his time came through reproductions like these. This is no good. This is no good for us. This is Rothko himself at a gallery exhibition at Betty Parsons Gallery, which is the gallery that he was part of in the late 1940s, surrounded by paintings, some of which I think are in the show, and they seem like gray rectangles on white rectangles. And I show you this because, as I mentioned, Rothko needs to be seen in the flesh, and that his work, again, not only defeats language, but slightly defeats reproduction. I would use a comparison here, actually. Jackson Pollock, who was Rothko's great, not rival is not quite the right word, compatriot, maybe, in abstract expressionism, a term that was invented in 1946, which none of the artists involved liked, least of all Rothko. Jackson Pollock's work was photographed in 1950 with him making the paintings, a very famous series of photographs taken by Hans Nemeth in his studio in East Hampton. And those photographs have become part of the mythology of Jackson Pollock. They became part of how he became so influential in the 1960s and 70s all across the world. Rothko was not photographed making his paintings. The way a Rothko is made is deeply complicated. If you speak to somebody who's a conservator of Rothko, they will be having the hardest time trying to restore a painting, trying to bring a painting back to life, because Rothko was not only experimental with the mixes of paint he used, often using things like egg tempera, much more familiar from medieval painting, but he kept his mixes to himself very often. Didn't like to talk too much about how his paintings were made. So the mystery is contained within those paintings too. A little bit about those compatriots, as I've called them. We know that this kind of procession of isms that we inherit from the story of art, the isms that run from Cubism through Surrealism, Expressionism, etc., the least reliable of them all is probably abstract expressionism, because some of it isn't abstract and some of it isn't expressionist. This is Clifford Still, great friend of Rothko's for a while, whose work, like Rothko's, is deeply involved with how color might become its own light source. Still once said a wonderful line, which was in a gallery show, He said you can turn the lights off because the paintings have their own inner fire. And you can actually see that for yourself in this exhibition. Not with Still, but with Rothko. I was walking through this morning, or this afternoon, and I noticed that in the final room, the lights are quite low. Some of you might have noticed that, very deliberately. And the paintings take a little longer to be experienced, consequently, as though you're in a dark room and your eyes are slowly adjusting to the light. You're getting the sense of the shape of the furniture and where the door is. I feel that way about Rothko too. And the low lighting allows his paintings to glow with that fire that's Still talked about. Again, red, though. What I haven't talked about yet is red and why red. I'll get there. This is Guston. I'm going to talk more about him a little bit later on, hopefully. Philip Guston, another abstract expressionist painter whose work was actually called abstract impressionist in his time because it owed so much, seemingly, to the late work of Monet, that very delicate, kind of chalky color, the pale atmosphere. But I love these paintings from the mid-1950s by Guston, which have a cluster of marks towards their center, as though there's something there, something underneath the surface of a body of water or glass trying to come to the surface. Something red. Again, red. Red is a color that these abstract expressionists return to because it seems to contain a certain kind of heat, but also seems to contain a certain kind of memory of a body's heat. I feel that the reds in Rothko, Still, and Guston have something to do with the body, has something to do with blood and the feeling of a body's heat. I will be talking a little bit more about that too. Another great abstract expressionist painter to be thought of maybe in a similar context to Rothko is Barnett Newman. This is a painting made in 1950, which is called Vir Heroicus Sublimis. Newman, a great titler of paintings, very dramatic titler of paintings, it should be said, unlike Rothko, believed in making paintings that would immerse the viewer in a field of color, as though you had stepped into a red zone. Now, here's where I think, personally, Rothko and Newman have something in common. It's not just the red field of color, which starts to be known as a kind of color field, but it's also the memory of figurative presence, the trace of a body, distant trace. Those white stripes, not all white actually, the stripes that run down the surface of the canvas, he called those zips, but I always think of them as being like figures, like a crowd. Some near to you, some further from you. They're lines that help you find your own place within the red field. And if you were to flip this painting, I could obviously do that if I had the PowerPoint skills required. If you flip this painting, you get a painting that was very similar to Rothko in its bands of color, in its organization of space. I consider that the red of Rothko is partly to do with that memory of a body and a body's heat, but also the structure of the painting itself seems to have something to do with the structure of the human watching it. Here's a lovely line from Barnett Newman. And yes, it's the 50s, and so the implied viewer is male, so I apologize for this, but this is the quote from Newman. "The viewer in front of my painting knows that he's there." It's mystical. It's mindful, actually. It's a reminder of one's own physicality. It's a reminder of one's own physical stature. The lines in the Newman seem to respond to the lines of the person standing in front of it. Therefore, there's a way that the viewer is somehow implicated in the painting. The viewer is like an actor on a stage. The viewer has to make the painting work. There's no painting without the viewer. The viewer brings the painting to life. This is true in Newman, and it's certainly true in Rothko. There is Newman and an unidentified female friend, possibly, standing in front of one of his great paintings on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, Rothko standing in front of one of his great paintings too. Rothko is very quotable. Here's another Rothko quote, very useful quote. He was asked, where is the best viewing position in front of your paintings? And he said, 18 inches. So 18 inches, what is that? I'm thinking of an LP, think of a record, make it a little bit bigger. So that's pretty close. For a painting the size of a Rothko, that's very close. Now, Rothko, again, said something wonderful. I'm going to paraphrase this. I don't know the quote verbatim in my head. Sometimes people make large paintings because they want to make a grand statement. They're a sort of history painter of the 19th century. They're a Géricault or a David. Rothko made paintings that were on a large scale because he wanted them to be more intimate. It's an interesting contradiction in terms. A large painting to feel more intimate. Because if you get 18 inches from the surface of a Rothko, then you will feel as though there is nothing but a Rothko in your field of vision. Your peripheral vision is filled with color, with red. You feel as though you're inside the painting, like it's a room. And in actual fact, Rothko said, I'm not making paintings, I'm making spaces. I'm making environments. I'm making places to be in, kind of rooms, as it were. Now, you might feel swallowed up by that painting, and that's how the painting is brought to life by the viewer. If you look at a painting, for example, let's go back to that Raphael that I saw through the doorway, because it's on my mind. Gilt frame, glazing, label. You see all of that, and all of those are signifiers that tell you that this is a Renaissance painting and it's in the Kunsthistorisches Museum and it has this level of art historical importance, etc., etc. And it slightly, no offense to the museum, by the way, slightly pulls you out of the experience of actually looking at the painting, slightly pulls you out of it, slightly makes you feel as though you're in an art history lecture. Whereas when you're standing in front of a Rothko, and there's no frame, and there's no glass, and you're 18 inches from it, there is no separation between you and the art. You are in the art, if it's really working. You are in a field of red. And just to reiterate that idea, because of our own bodies, because of our own physicality, the red works with us in a certain way, kind of rhymes with us, rhymes with our own physicality. It's the way I feel about it. I consider it wonderful, this, because I look out at your faces and you're immersed in red. You see, I'll prove my point. I wasn't planning that, actually. We've proved it. This is Newman, just another Barnett Newman painting, just to think about something of immersion. It's got the wonderful title of Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? So that is a little about him. I don't want to claim that red is the only color in his body of work by any means. Certainly, one could do a great lecture on Rothko's use of blue, or even his use of brown, or his use of purple. But I feel that red is a note that runs all the way through his career, his long career. Redness, and what redness does to us as viewers, seems to be particularly important. 3 paintings from different parts of his career. This painting on the left-hand side from 1938 is actually not in the exhibition, but I thought it was very exciting to see a very early painting by Rothko, which has a Rothko in it, seemingly. It has a little Rothko. Almost. It certainly has this blazing red canvas sitting there. The kind of painting that Rothko would go on to paint in the 1950s, but at this particular point is still working within a figurative mode. It's important to remember that this decision that Rothko makes to dedicate himself to abstraction in the 1940s means releasing himself from the figure. That means that in a simple way, it means that color has to do the job that a figure once did. What the figure was doing in the painting, what figures do in paintings, they've been made unemployed now, the rise of abstraction. What you have instead is color and mark making and scale and touch doing the job of that, doing the job of the figure, being the expressive component in a painting, in other words. That's what I think we get from a great Rothko. Now, I want to really hone in, keeping an eye on time, I want to hone in on some important influences on Rothko. And for me, this is one of the really crucial ones. And it probably is quite apparent to you looking at it why I've chosen it, because it is a painting where red seems to have soaked the canvas. This is a painting by Henri Matisse. Many of you, I'm sure, will know it. It is called The Red Studio. It has been in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York since 1949. Now, I wouldn't mention dates like that unless they were significant. Of course, it is significant, because in 1949, Rothko is a regular visitor to the Museum of Modern Art, where he is able to commune with European modernism, where he's able to have conversations across time. Now, what we find ourselves talking about with Rothko more and more is ancientness. We find ourselves talking about the Greeks. We find ourselves talking about the Egyptians. I can talk a little bit about the Romans. But we should also remember that he was deeply involved with European modern art of the early 20th century. 1911, this was painted by Matisse. It's a vision of paradise, painted by an atheist. It's a vision of what an earthly Eden might look like. We are in Matisse's own studio. The grandfather clock in the center has no hands, has no digits. Time is suspended because we are in paradise, a paradise of making, where nearly everything you see is made by him, from the ceramics to the sculpture to the paintings on the walls. Even, and for me the most charming moment of all, right at the bottom of the painting is a box of crayons, blue crayons, for you, as it were, left there so you can grab one and start drawing yourself. There's such amazing joy and, of course, sensuality in Matisse. And by the way, we don't often find ourselves using words like joy and sensuality to talk about Rothko. So the question has to be, why did Rothko find himself gravitating to this painting? Why did he find himself returning to it? He said, every week, perhaps even more regularly, as he lived just around the corner. Matisse's Red Studio is a bit more complex than it looks, and that's always the case with Matisse. He started out by painting it ochre, yellow, painted over parts of it blue, and then decided to dedicate himself completely to red. So even in my reproduction, you might be able to see bits of yellow and blue poking through. He leaves the canvas bare where he wants to make an outline. So that kind of, you can see it quite well, I think. And that table, for example, the weird perspective of that table, which looks almost totally flat, has got this yellow line. That's underneath the red. So there's a sense of layering. And again, that's something you see with Rothko. Rothko's reds resonate the way they do because there's so much inside them. It's not just red, there's so much else. You can actually see that yourself. You can see it by looking at the paintings themselves. So Red Studio, up in MoMA since 1949, is something he returns to over and over again. There's another painting here now. This is not in the Museum of Modern Art. It's in St. Petersburg, or Moscow, I think. It is called Harmony in Red from 1908 by Matisse. I just wanted to show you this as well because it's another great Matisse 1908 painting, again, where there are layers to the color. And actually, you can see it on this reproduction at the bottom. You can see that the color that he first put down was a sort of green. So it was going to be harmony in green. Then he made a decision that red would be more effective. Of course, the red that you see is not really a red that you would see in reality. It's a kind of imagined red. It's a felt red. And it's red, so it's got to be felt. It's got to be sensuous. It's got to be experienced by the body. I'm so intrigued by the thought of Rothko, a very serious, scholarly, intellectual man, looking at the work of an artist who's dedicated to pure pleasure in his work. It's an interesting contradiction in terms. But I would say something almost as important for Rothko was another book. It's a book written by Matisse called Notes of a Painter, which is a very wonderful book. And in Notes of a Painter, Matisse said, expression in a painting is not about the contortion of a face. It's not about dramatic action in a body. It's about relationships of colors and marks. Matisse said, when you see a painting, before you know what the painting is of, before you know the subject matter of that painting, it needs to be working on you already. It needs to be doing something to you. We want to liberate ourselves somewhat from the idea of content, the idea of a painting as a storytelling machine. We want to make instead a painting that's going to spark off certain kinds of sensory sparks in the viewer through using color in a certain kind of relationship. Another very important influence on Rothko are these frescoes. These are frescoes that are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. They have been there since 1903. They are from a place called Bosco Reale, not too far from Pompeii. And they are, like Pompeii's paintings, what's called second style paintings. They were made during the Roman Republic. So they were made maybe, who knows, the early years of BC or the early years of AD, around that time. What you see here is perhaps not so significant for Rothko, except for the idea of paintings completely covering walls and being separated by architectonic elements. In other words, these pillars, these columns that separate the space that runs through the environment of the room. The paintings become the walls. Clyfford Still said, I want to destroy the wall. When I put a painting up on the wall, I want the wall to vanish because we are now in the zone of the painting. We are no longer in a room. But when you look at something like this, it's undeniable. It's undeniable that there is a very, very important influence and how color is used. This is one of the Bosco Reale frescoes. He's known this for many years by the time he makes that painting on the right-hand side. And you can see, quite simply, the idea of the figure being taken away and those bands of color being used. But not just used, or not at all used, maybe, for decorative effects, used for expressive effect. I always think it's fascinating to think, how does a modern artist see the art of the past? How does a contemporary artist? And very often it means being a kind of magpie. Very often it means being someone who will take one thing and leave something else. Rothko's interest in Roman wall painting wasn't that of a historian. He saw them as being contemporary. He saw them as being just as urgent and vital and communicative as anything made by his fellow abstract expressionists. He saw them as new. So when he does, in fact, go to Italy, this is him in the center lying on his belly in Paestum, again, not too far from Pompeii, he finds himself coming into contact with a kind of approach to making paintings that feels to him absolutely of his time. Most important of all being this one room. Now, I think many of you may have been here. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it. This is Pompeii. This is the Villa of the Mysteries, so called because what's happening in the paintings in the villa is still mysterious to historians. There are many theories about what these people are doing within these paintings, but we cannot be certain, A, of what they're doing, or B, of why it was painted. Now, a historian will be frustrated by that. Some of you in the audience might be frustrated with that kind of answer too. But an artist like Rothko sees that as an enormous boon, a bonus, a painting we don't know anything about or can't be certain about. A painting full of mystery has just what Rothko himself is looking for in his own paintings. So, the Villa of the Mysteries has these, again, you have to do a very simple trick when looking at these. Take the figures out. We'll do more than that, but take the figures out. And you can see a room with a series of deep crimson squares, bisected by dark lines, which are, again, architectonic lines. They are like columns. But the figures are there. And I don't want to suggest for a second that Rothko went somewhere like this and ignored them, said, I'm only interested in the red. Actually, he was interested in what this room might have been for. Now, what we know is that the content of the paintings in this particular room in the Villa of the Mysteries relates to the cult of Dionysus, the cult of the god of wine and of creativity and of rebirth. This is a god, or a mythology, that Rothko was very interested in because he'd read about Dionysus through Nietzsche. So his most important, arguably, most important philosophical touchstone was Nietzsche and his theories of the Apollonian and the Dionysiac, control and release, order and chaos. And you actually very often find those sorts of relationships happening within one painting by Rothko. That tension, that dialectic is happening in the paintings themselves. When you look, for example, this is a room many of you may be familiar with in Tate Modern, although originally they were made to hang in what was then Tate Gallery, now Tate Britain. These paintings hung as Rothko wanted them, near the floor, no frames, no glass, grey walls, dim lighting. That has an effect as though you are entering a purpose-built architectural space, just like the Villa of the Mysteries, where something somber and serious is evoked just by what the color is doing. I've been into this room countless times, and every time I'm in there, when there's somebody on the outside having a conversation with their friend, and they're in another part of the gallery, and they come into this room, they start whispering. It's like going into a church. They suddenly feel that they need to behave themselves. They suddenly feel that they're in a kind of sacred zone. There's nothing in the paintings to say that. It's something about what the color and the scale does to you as a person. This, again, is the moment where I say, Rothko defeats language. That is a moment where you really see it happening. Have a look at this beautiful painting. Again, unknown artist, unknown reason. Content is slightly lost to us too. In relationship with these paintings from the Seagram cycle. These paintings, some of which are gathered here in the exhibition, were famously or infamously, one might say, commissioned by the architect, from the architect Philip Johnson, for the walls of a private dining room in the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building on Park Avenue, New York. It's a strange commission for Rothko to accept. There's lots of literature around why Rothko would have accepted such a commission. The walls of a restaurant, an artist who was so serious, so deeply committed to a communication of color, the idea of what he called the tragic and the timeless. But there are many reasons why artists accept commissions, and probably a lot of them are financial. Regardless, Rothko changed his mind about the commission, withdrew from it, returned the money to the Canadian whiskey company Seagram that had put up the money for the commission, and kept the paintings himself almost until the day he died. Rothko's paintings attempt to communicate something of that power and mystery that you find within those Villa of the Mysteries paintings. And as they say in Monty Python, now for something completely different. Because there's a tendency, or there's a temptation, to hear all of this talk of the tragic and the timeless, and to think, isn't there room for something else too? Does it all have to be so solemn, so serious? A younger generation of artists who emerged in the mid-1950s in New York took Rothko's fields of color as a starting point and muddied them up and dirtied them. Here are two works of art by the great American artist. I mean, what sort of artist was he? So neo-Dada, proto-pop, who knows? Robert Rauschenberg, who made these paintings in the middle 1950s. In effect, they're red abstractions, only they've got detritus stuck to them, things from the world. It's as though the doors of Rothko's studio have been blown open and the rubbish from the street has blown in and stuck to the canvases. Rauschenberg said, "I want to act in the gap between art and life." Rothko's work exists very much in the realm of art. By doing this, Rauschenberg is crossing a boundary, a sacred boundary, actually, a sacred boundary to the abstract expressionists, where he allows for noise and mess and silliness to become part of a sort of abstract language. Perhaps even more so is Jasper Johns. This work on the left-hand side was made by Jasper Johns in 1957. And I'm showing you this because I hope you see the connection. First of all, not just with Rothko, but also with that amazing Barnett Newman painting, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? This is called Book, and it is a book. And it is painted with encaustic paint, which is pigment, raw color mixed with wax. So it's got a strange physicality to it. It's got kind of density to the surface. Painted in primary colors, but looks like an abstract painting, and yet is of the world we live in. Again, dirtying up that abstraction, opening the doors of the studio. On the right-hand side, perhaps even more pointedly, Jasper Johns uses stenciled text to play around with the kind of language games that I mentioned in the Josef Albers quote. If I'm an artist and I want to write red on the surface of my grey painting, it's up to me. I can play around with what language means. You see the word red, but you see the color grey. Something is happening within your perception. He's dismantling word and image like a good Duchampian. Duchamp being anathema to Rothko. Here too, in a painting that looks nothing like Rothko, and yet is sort of related to it. Jasper Johns' painting Flag from 1954, which again is in the Museum of Modern Art, which is a complex philosophical puzzle and a beautifully made object. Somewhere, as they often say about Jasper Johns, between Duchamp and Cézanne, with this gorgeous painterly surface. But it's not a painting of the sublime. It's not a painting of the tragic and timeless. It's a painting of the utterly banal, the utterly everyday. I'm sure you're aware, if you go to America, you see the stars and stripes everywhere, on every carton of milk, on every bus, stars and stripes. Something, as Johns would put it, the mind already knows. Now, these could be seen as being parodies of Rothko in a way, but every parody, I would say, is itself a kind of tribute, a kind of homage. You could say that there's a certain kind of learning happening too. I'm going to move past Ellsworth Kelly and go straight on to Warhol. There's a wonderful sort of bloodline happening. I use the word deliberately. In the Museum of Modern Art's collection. From the wonderful Red Studio by Matisse from 1911 through to the great red Barnett Newman from 1950 and the great red Rothkos from the same time, to this painting of 1963, Orange Car Crash by Andy Warhol, which looks like an insult to Rothko and to the supporters of Rothko. Because it is a colour-field painting. It is an expanse of orangey red on the right-hand side, and on the left, a photograph taken from a tabloid newspaper of a death. Not of a death of the sublime and Shakespearean variety that Rothko talked about, but a banal, everyday, sad waste of a life. A car accident. Warhol's work responds to Rothko's in a way that is, yes, to some extent satirical. To some extent, he's critiquing Rothko's inability or lack of willingness to engage with the real world, the world of people's real lives. And yet, it's also in itself a kind of abstract painting, a painting that belongs to a language that was formed by the abstract expressionists only about 10 years before this painting was made. Really struck me going to see these paintings by Warhol, there's one on the left, that he never really got over Rothko. That in those early works, when Rothko was still very much the darling at that particular point in the early 60s of the New York art world, this point, Rothko is dead. He's been dead for 7 years by the time Warhol makes this painting on the left-hand side. And it's actually one of a series of paintings that are hung next to each other along a wall in a place called Deer Beacon, which is in upstate New York, not too far from Manhattan. They are called the Shadows series. And if you saw that painting on the left-hand side, you'd swear it was a kind of Rothko that had been knocked off its easel, or some sort of a slightly tweaked Rothko. It is, in fact, a silkscreen based on a photograph of a shadow in Warhol's studio. And because it doesn't show a celebrity face, as Warhol is so famous for, it seems to have a certain kind of melancholy. The fact there's no face there makes it feel more empty, makes it feel more blank, makes it feel more melancholy, makes it feel more Rothko-esque. I really think that in these Shadows paintings of the late 70s, Warhol is thinking back on that reference, that influence that he developed in the early 1960s. So a few more things to show you. This is Guston. Now, Guston is back. And Guston, who was a member, although very slightly on the fringe, you might say, of the abstract expressionists, famously in the late 1970s returns to the dreaded figure, the figure that everyone was supposed to have given up on, the figure that everyone was supposed to have renounced. Well, Guston returns to it, and this odd painting shows, and it takes a while to figure this out, arms, fists holding clubs to beat people with, like truncheons. Guston says, in the late 1960s, really towards the end of Rothko's career, he says, who am I, with everything that's happening in the world, with all of the catastrophic change of the 1960s, who am I to be in this world, to go back to my studio, to close the door, and to change a red to a blue? He felt that abstraction was no longer capable of speaking. Now, this idea, I think, is part of Rothko's story. Rothko believed that abstraction was actually the best way of speaking because it required no prior knowledge. It required only eyes to see and a body to receive or participate in. Guston's work, again, complicates the legacy, and yet it's so related to it. In this painting, I see those fantastic late Rothkos, bisected grey and black, very kind of reduced in their palette, but he's, again, adding a figurative element that was expunged from abstraction much earlier on. I want to show you just a couple more things. I might just hop past. No, I can't hop past this. What am I doing? Can't hop past this. Helen Frankenthaler. The great Helen Frankenthaler was one might say, second-generation abstract expressionist painter, although she's not really an abstract expressionist. She's more like a kind of color field painter who developed an idea that's in Rothko and brought it into a completely new realm of expression. And that idea was the notion that you could allow paint to be absorbed completely into the surface of a canvas, that you could allow the canvas to act as a kind of sponge, to absorb color. In Rothko, sometimes he stains the canvas, watering his paint down with so much turpentine that the red actually sinks into the surface. Frankenthaler made that principle the basis of what her work does and is about. Her work fuses color and surface. They are one and the same. And what you get is these amazingly rich color experiences, like that amazing painting that you see on the left-hand side, which, as you can tell, is gargantuan. Just a few more things. We're thinking of where it goes. Rothko seems to be, along with Pollock, the artist to contend with by the young artists in America of the 1950s and 60s, the artist that you have to defeat. You have to beat him somehow. In a slightly later generation of the minimalists, very slightly later, Rothko's use of color provides a certain kind of inspiration for using color in its purest sense. On the left-hand side is an untitled work by Donald Judd from 1970, which is in the Tate, and that is a copper box whose interior is painted with red automobile paint. Not oil, not tempera, something that comes from the world of culture, the world of car culture to be specific, and yet the color itself is dense and rich and almost, you might say, sublime. And the same would go for that work on the right-hand side, Dan Flavin. Reduce your means. Use less to say more. That's the great lesson of somebody like Dan Flavin. And that is indeed a fluorescent light, a very normal object with a red gel that allows it to create a pulsing, soft red light, so reminiscent of Rothko in its coloring, but not just that. Reminiscent of Rothko in that it involves the whole space of the room. When the work is turned off at night, there is no more artwork. It's got to be on. And there's got to be people in the room to become, again, absorbed by that color. When Rothko went to see Red Studio in MoMA, he said the most amazing thing about that painting is that you become absorbed by color. You become absorbed by it. If you see a work by Flavin, you may have a similar sort of experience. It means that the relationship is a phenomenological one. It's to do with your body's relationship to space, less than it is your preconceived ideas and what you bring with you into the gallery space. I'm going to conclude with a couple of more recent things. This is an artist who appears at the same time and in the same circle of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. This is very late, painting by Cy Twombly, a series called Bacchus. Bacchus, Dionysus. And it's a painting from a series of paintings. Here's an installation shot where the aging artist, like the aging Matisse, actually, uses a brush on the end of a stick to create looping marks in very thinned red paint that dribble down the surface of the canvas. Now, why Bacchus? Partly because Cy Twombly was so deeply involved with classical mythology, but also because Bacchus, as I mentioned before, is not just the god of wine, the god of creativity, he's the god of rebirth. There's a certain kind of association between redness and rebirth that certainly Twombly is plugging into, and I think Rothko is plugging into as well. It's certainly because of the dramatic nature of the gesture, you can see an aging body raging against his body's own weakness. Something you actually see in the late Rothko too, where his scale is reduced because he simply can't produce energetic, large-scale paintings anymore. Last of all, if I was going to find a contemporary artist, a living artist, who I think best epitomizes this idea about color as space, about color as musical, about color as communicative, I would point to the American artist James Turrell. Here are two works by him, which, like Rothko, it's more extreme, are totally unphotographable. So when you look at these, and you may not have seen his work before, you may know it very well. His work deliberately, I think, does not translate A into images and B into words. You just have to experience it. And the experience is entering color, entering a space where you are suffused with color, you're floating in color, just as Rothko intended, but also just as Rothko saw in Matisse, and I would say, as he saw in Pompeii, actually. This is a church, small chapel in Berlin, made by Turrell in 2015, which changes color very, very slowly. The color is, of course, artificial, but unlike Dan Flavin, the fact that the color is artificial does not seem to be the salient point of the work. What seems to be the salient point of the work is the fact that color, when used sensitively, when used spatially, can speak to us in a way that seems to collapse time. I think that Rothko's intention was to collapse time, and I think that red was the medium through which he was able to do that. Thank you very much.